In our previous lecture, I spoke about the emergence of civilization in the ancient Near East, more particularly about the emergence of civilization in Egypt and Mesopotamia. In between these two great powers is the Arabian Peninsula with its northern extension on the eastern Mediterranean coast. To the north are the Hittite lands. I described Egypt and Mesopotamia as the great superpowers of the ancient world. This is somewhat analogous to the US and USSR of the Cold War period. And I recall as a graduate student keeping that idea in front of me when thinking of the conflicts between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on one's historical view, this is a conflict about which many young students are no longer aware. They're aware that America is now the great superpower, so one has to find other analogies with which to describe the ancient Near Eastern civilization. In speaking about these two great superpowers, I emphasized the development of culture and put special emphasis on the idea of writing and organization. Now, in these cultures in between, among the Hittites and the Canaanites, we have peoples who are, in a sense, buffeted by these two great cultures. They live under the influence of them because each of the superpowers had spheres of influence which they controlled. Among these peoples, whose names are familiar to many of us from the biblical narratives, are Moabites, Phoenicians, Edomites. These and many other peoples lived in the interstices, as it were, of the great superpowers of the ancient Near East. The myths of these peoples, and it is myths on which we want to focus in this series, the myths were similar to the myths of the great civilizations, but there were also striking differences. So there's influence and there's difference. I will move from the question of the Canaanites, who were they, and their description, to conclude the lecture with the story of the Hittites, a group thought of as a lost civilization. Now, empire in the ancient Near East was focused on the two great civilizational centers, the Nile River Valley and the Tigris and the Euphrates River Valley. And at certain points in ancient Near Eastern history, we have empire emerging in the north, especially among the Hittites. We do not have this in the region of Syria and Canaan, where we have small city-states, each with their own distinctive culture. So in the first part of our lecture, I'd like to tell a tale of two cities, of two city-states in the Canaanite areas, which had a profound influence on the area. And here we can see influence as emanating from a small urban center, not influence as exerted by a great superpower. The first of our cities is Ebla, E-B-L-A, a city whose remains were found in northern Syria. And in 3000 BC, or rather in the third millennium BC, after 3000 BC, when the Old Kingdom was established in Egypt and the Sumerians were ruling in southern and central Mesopotamia, this city-state arose in Syria, between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean. And its economic and political influence was felt very widely. The site of this kingdom was discovered in the 1970s by Italian archaeologists digging in Syria. And the archives of the city were discovered within the first few years of the excavations. This was a great surprise and joy to the excavators, because often excavators can dig for years before they find textual material. I mentioned in an earlier lecture that archaeological sites may yield much information because of the artifacts, but they don't always yield inscriptions. What we have in Ebla was a quick yield of thousands of documents. And these documents were basically administrative, and they told us about the economic development of the city. What they didn't offer is myth. So there was great excitement because all this material had been discovered, but there was some disappointment because nothing religious or literary was found. And I must say that reading these documents, after one reads the great myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the myth of Kumarbi of the Hittites, is quite disappointing. This is a set of materials which drones on and on. It's as if we found the ancient accounting lists of American corporations, but found none of our great books. Or if we found the accounting tapes digitized of great businesses, but we found no books, no CDs, no music. So there are certain cultures about which there's a prejudice, not always fair, that they're boring. This is often said of Ebla, but I want to assert it's not true. It's not that they're boring, it's simply that we have not found what's most interesting to historians of culture. So an Eblaite text could be a list: 3 jars of oil, 2 sheep, 7 sacks of good grain. And that's the interesting part. The less interesting part differentiates between different kinds of minerals that they're digging for. Right? This appeals to the accounting mind, but not to the literary mind. What they did keep in Ebla is some form of narrative. King lists, such as the Sumerians kept, and some fragmentary list of historical events. We know that sometime in the 3rd millennium BC, Ebla was destroyed, sometime in the mid-millennium. Then it was revived. It was destroyed again in the 2nd millennium. To clarify, I mean between 2000 and 1000. And it was destroyed again in that millennium, not to arise. Now, they found all of these documents. Whether they're boring or not, I'll leave it to the students who I hope will look at these documents to decide. What they do reveal is something fascinating about language. Here at Ebla, we have a language that has many affinities with the Semitic language group: Hebrew, Arabic, the languages of Ethiopia, Aramaic. It has many affinities with words and concepts that can be found in the Hebrew Bible. And all of this from a millennium before the Hebrew Bible. So Ebla has had a considerable effect on the study of ancient Near Eastern history, although it hasn't provided us yet with mythic material. It has provided us with what I think can be claimed to be the first dictionary. And these are bilingual lexical lists, a technical way of saying lists in which you have words in 2 languages, and you have the equivalents in Eblaite, which is what we call the language of Ebla, and Sumerian, the language of Sumer. So I think it would be fair to say that this is the world's first dictionary. So along with the world's firsts that I enumerated in the first 2 lectures in our series, I want to add this: lexicography to the accomplishments of the ancient Near East. The second city, and the city which offers a richness of mythic material, is the story of Ugarit, the city on the Mediterranean coast. Excavations there have uncovered administrative texts and mythic texts. And the story of Ugarit and its discovery has something of an Atlantis quality. That is, it appeals to our interest in civilizations that existed and then were lost, and they were barely heard of, or they were hinted at in the records of other societies, but we really didn't know where they were and what exactly they did. In Ugarit, also in Syria, closer to the Mediterranean, archaeologists, this time from France, you'll recall that the archaeologists at Ebla were from Italy, uncovered an international trading city with a highly developed culture and a great literature which had been lost to Near Eastern cultural memory. The discovery of the city of Ugarit, like the discovery of many Near Eastern sites was accidental. And here I want to bring up the whole subject of accidents and our topic, ancient Near Eastern archaeology and mythology. It seems that the hand of destiny is guiding many of the people who find these artifacts, because when you hear the stories about how they were discovered, they just as well could not have been discovered. How was the city of Ugarit discovered? In 1928, a peasant in Syria was plowing his field, a well-watered field not far from the Mediterranean Sea. He could see the Mediterranean from his field, and he ran his plow into a big stone. And he assumed the stone was a stone that hadn't been taken out of the field, which really angered him because he had contracted to clear the field for plowing. And when he uncovered the stone, he noticed its unusual shape. Luckily, and I say luckily from a scientific standpoint, there were scientific archaeologists from a French mission in the area. They went to look at this stone, which they uncovered, and it was part of a tomb. And what struck the people who saw this in 1928 was that the tomb bore a remarkable resemblance to the tombs of the Mycenaeans in Greece. What this was doing on the other side of the Mediterranean really mystified them, and it generated the wish among the French, both the French government and these French archaeologists, to excavate this site as soon as possible. And this was done very expeditiously. Sometimes the history of archaeology is very plodding and slow, but in this case it was very fast. In 1929, an expedition began to clear this land and excavate it, and they quickly discovered many tablets written in the cuneiform script of Mesopotamia. They deciphered, translated, and published these scripts within another year, that is, by 1930. And the world of ancient Near Eastern studies was taken by storm, as was the world of biblical studies, because this material, much of which was literary, mythic, tales of the gods, legends of great heroes, laws that related to religious ritual, much of this material cast light on the material in the Hebrew Bible. So accident played a role here, and accident has played a role in some of the other materials that we'll discuss in this series, among them the Amarna letters, A-M-A-R-N-A, the letters from Egypt between the court of King Akhenaten and the vassal kings of Asia. These letters were found by a woman, again, a peasant in Egypt, who was searching through a field, and she saw these little pieces of clay, and they had some kind of markings on them, but they weren't hieroglyphs. Now, local people in Egypt, this is in the end of the 19th century, knew that if they found something with hieroglyphs on it, it was valuable. But these were other kinds of markings. They just looked like lines in various positions on the tablets. So the woman thought that they were of no value. Probably somebody had decorated some pieces of clay, and she began to grind them up to use as fertilizer, because it was well known that certain types of clay were good fertilizer. Now, how many she ground up, we don't know. But luckily, someone else in the area heard about these markings, looked at them, and realized they were cuneiform. But they were out of place. As we've been saying, cuneiform is the language of Mesopotamia. What were they doing in Egypt? Something was wrong. But in order to discover what was wrong, people had to decipher them, and they turned out to be one of the great finds of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So accidents play a role. Of course, accidents played a role in the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, arguably the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century. So these texts, as I said, were quickly deciphered and published. They revealed this rich civilization, and a civilization with affinities with biblical and Canaanite civilization. They showed that Ugarit's physical situation its position on the Mediterranean coast enabled it to be a cultural and trading center between the islands of the Mediterranean, Egypt, and the hinterland of West Asia, that is, the Hittite countries and Mesopotamia. So this became a kind of hub city for the ancient world. Among the many literary and mythological texts, archaeologists deciphered what they called the epics of the gods, descriptions of the various gods and their adventures. And we will discuss these in greater detail in later lectures. Ugarit was among the cities destroyed in the invasions of the Sea Peoples around 1200 BC. And among their gods were El, Baal, and Anat, three gods that are familiar to many readers of the Bible who will know their names from the biblical narratives. So Ugarit, a great find, rich in mythological materials, unlike Ebla, cast considerable light on the interconnections between the civilizations. In our last lecture, we talked about comparisons, Egypt as opposed to Mesopotamia. Here I want to advance the idea of interconnections. What we find from the documents is that these societies were in touch with each other. As one wit has put it, the mail was much better in the second millennium BC in the Middle East than it is today. And I actually think it's true. And actually, in some places in the Near East, it was better than it now is in the United States. That is, they had messengers between cities, between countries, and very importantly for our understanding of how myths develop, they had translators. I mentioned these dictionary documents from Ebla, and I'm asserting that they're among the first dictionaries. We know that there were active translators in all of these societies, so that myths, stories, records get translated and transmitted from one society to another, and in this way, societies influence each other. So let us move from these two Syrian cities, Ebla and Ugarit, to the Hittite kingdom in Anatolia, that is what today would be Central and Eastern Turkey. There, a great empire began to develop in the second millennium BC, and it was centered on the city of Hattusas, which was established in approximately 1800 BC. This culture used a cuneiform system of writing, but they did not use the languages of their Mesopotamian neighbors. Rather, they used a language that we now think of as Indo-European. They became very powerful and threatened, and at one point conquered the great empire of Babylon. They too, the Hittites, were eventually conquered by the Sea Peoples of approximately 1200 to 1100 BC. Now, always returning to our idea of myth, we need to ask, do the Hittites offer us mythic materials? Have we found them? Do we find more than administrative lists? And the answer is assertively yes. There's a great richness of mythic material. What is distinctive about it is that these myths are tied by the Hittites themselves to rituals. You will recall that I mentioned the myth and ritual approach to the study of myth, where theorists make the connection between people's stories and people's rituals. What is remarkable is that the Hittites themselves made these connections. They would write down stories, and they would give instructions about when and how these stories are to be repeated. Now, the Hittites also have a place to play in modern history, as strange as this may sound, because in the formation of the identity and nationalism in modern Turkey, in the secular state of Turkey, there's a hearkening back to the Hittites. And if one goes to Istanbul and travels through Turkey, you can see the display of Hittite architecture, Hittite artifacts, and in the Great Museum in Istanbul, the Archaeological Museum, a rich display of Hittite materials. And this is in keeping, this observation about the Hittites is in keeping with a point that I will be making throughout, that the modern Middle East, in its political forms, in its modern nationalisms, continually is looking back at the ancient East. In order to understand themselves, modern Middle Eastern peoples are referring back to ancient peoples. Now, the Hittites are truly a lost civilization. This was the kind of civilization that television programs about the lost worlds love to feature. Something completely forgotten that was discovered through sheer accident and diligence. Until the late 19th century, almost nothing was known about them. The name was preserved in the Hebrew Bible, the name Hittite, most famously in the story of Ephron the Hittite, a prince who deals with the patriarch Abraham. But in that biblical story in the book of Genesis, there's no intimation that the Hittites are a great empire or had been a great empire. What is that story? We read in Genesis that the Hittites owned land in the area of the city of Hebron. And as the Bible recounts it in Genesis 23, Abraham seeks a burial place for his wife, Sarah, his beloved wife. And Abraham stood up from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Het, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me possession of a burying place, that I might bury my dead. Who are these children of Het? They're the Hittites. They agree to give Abraham a place to bury his wife. Abraham offers to purchase it from them. They want to give it to him, but he insists on purchasing it for 400 shekels of silver in order to make sure that it is an acquisition of himself and his family. There's an assurance of the permanence of the acquisition in the biblical narrative. To quote again from Genesis, and the field and the cave that is therein were made sure unto Abraham for a possession of a burying place by the sons of Het, the Hittites. So the picture we get from this biblical episode is of Abraham, an outsider, negotiating with Ephron, the Hittite prince, an insider. This bewildered many students of the Bible because we don't know of references to the Hittites as insiders in this culture. But now that the Hittite civilization has been uncovered and that its writings have been deciphered and published, we understand that the Hittites themselves were outsiders in Canaan, but outsiders who could gain influence because they were members of a powerful empire. And again, to take us back to our superpower analogy with which I opened the lecture, much as Americans today might, in a foreign country, have the purchasing power to buy a house or a piece of beachfront or a villa. And we have the diplomatic protection of the United States to ensure that we could live there safely, or at least this has been true in many places until recently. So we, in a sense, are a kind of modern Hittite. We might be an outsider in another place, but because of our position in the world, we can gain a kind of insider status. Now, this understanding of the biblical story was only possible through the discovery of Hittite civilization. I mentioned that it had been lost, unknown. It was found through the efforts of scholars in fields in the triad that I've enumerated a number of times of philology, linguistics, archaeology, and religious and biblical studies. That is, there's an interplay of these scholars which allowed the picture of the Hittites to emerge. I mentioned the Amarna letters, the 14th century BC writings found in Egypt on tablets written in cuneiform, the tablets found by that peasant woman. In these tablets, archaeologists were able to read letters from Egyptian subordinates, vassals in Western Asia who were writing to the Egyptian courts. And one of the things that they wrote a number of times is, quote, "The Hittites are invading our territory." That is, territory held by Egypt along the Mediterranean was being attacked by the Hittites. Now, when these letters were discovered and translated, the Amarna letters, people didn't know who the Hittites were, other than the biblical reference. So how could the Hittites be attacking the all-powerful Egyptians? In the subsequent decades, the decades after the discovery of these letters, archaeologists began to discover tablets in cuneiform script in Anatolia, in Turkey. These tablets were deciphered by the early 20th century, and the site of the Hittite capital, Hattusas, in Turkey, was discovered. And in it, there was a rich archive of both administrative and mythic material. The excavation of this material began in the 1910s and the 1920s, and scholars were able to see the remarkable achievements of the Hittite civilization and its connections to other Near Eastern cultures. Let me illustrate one of these connections. And here, once again, let us go back to the idea of the great powers, the superpowers. The great powers were Egypt and whoever was ruling in Mesopotamia. Among the finds at Hattusas were the inscriptions which recorded treaties and negotiations between these cultures. So there is a text which we can read of the treaty between Ramses II, identified as the pharaoh of the Exodus, and the Hittite king Hattusilas. The whole treaty is spelled out. How to divide the land, how to end the conflict. It's actually a model which many people have invoked for ending conflict in that part of the world. This is one of many documents which parallel the Amarna letters. You'll recall that the Amarna letters found in Egypt gave evidence of connections with the Middle East, that is, with Western Asia and the Mediterranean shore. Here, these documents found to the north, that is, in the Hittite country, in Turkey, showed evidence of connections with Egypt. So as the picture emerged in the 20th century of the material in these documents, we get a web of connections. And that is the picture that I'd like you to have and to develop as we go on. That is, the ancient Near East was a series of connecting cultures. At the Hittite capital and at other sites, there were many versions of myths, including a myth we have mentioned, and I will mention many times again, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story which had international appeal and circulation. Therefore, it's hard to speak of a definitive, original version of a myth. That is, every one of the stories that we're going to encounter in this series is going to have variations. There is no fixed text. Let us contrast this with our idea of a text today. The Harry Potter books. The Harry Potter books, when a child goes to the store and buys the Harry Potter book, every copy of that book in every store is the same. Of course, that's natural. But this is not true in the ancient Near East. In fact, it'd be odd to find any two copies that are alike. Variation is the story, not singularity. These texts evolved, and they evolved through dissemination. They would start in one culture and go to another. Once in the second culture, they might be influenced and move back to the first. So one of the fascinating ways in which we can trace cultural connections in the ancient Near East is to look at variations in ancient Near Eastern mythology.